Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are now talking about Bianchi chapters 3 and 4 and the articles by Bahagat, Walker, and Parsi. And what I'd like to do right now is just discuss briefly, I haven't looked at all the discussion questions, but maybe some of the important issues and some of the fascinating insights we get from the readings. So I'll get right to it. Bianchi chapter 3. Wow, who would have thought that the Dutch played such an integral role in almost manufacturing the modern Hajj industry, right? And you'll recall from the video yesterday that we're interested in talking about or understanding Hajj not necessarily as a religious ritual, but also as a highly politicized industry. So when you look, of course, at the chapter, you're understanding that the Dutch, of course, were one of the major colonial powers in South Asia, Southeast Asia, as early as the 1600s. And so they had a strong foothold in Indonesia. And, you see all these sort of pious Muslims. And, of course, the Dutch looking at them saying, in sort of derogatory, even, sort of racist fashion, this religion is fanatical, etc. And one impulse that they had, or one fear that they had, was that the Indonesians, of course, would be political. So in order to, of course, distance them from any sort of political threat, what if they want to break away? What if they want to make a revolution? What if they want to sort of, liberate themselves? Let's have them go deeper into their religion, right? So that's really sort of that's kind of, in a nutshell, how the Dutch instigated or encouraged the Indonesians to start showing a lot more, sort of propensity, or encourage them to actually go on the Hajj, to go all the way to Mecca, which is thousands of miles away. And back then, over 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was extremely difficult as compared to today. So you have the role of the Dutch really spawning the modern Hajj industry. They didn't realize, of course, as Bianchi mentions, that the Hajj itself is an experience which is not only just spiritual, but it's something that, because it links and it bonds people globally across the world, spiritually, that it therefore challenges nationalist and sort of ethnic identity boundaries, right? So it's going to make these Indonesians, one way or another, sort of aware, oh my God, you know what, we sort of belong to a group anyway, right? We belong to this Muslim group. And, you're sort of exploiting me. So something to keep in mind. So I'm just jumping forward now to chapter 4, when Bianchi looks at the sort of later development of the Hajj, certainly within the 20th century, and it's sort of what we can say the post-colonial period. And the importance, of course, of the OIC, right, the Office of the Islamic Cooperation, which of course is sort of headquartered in Saudi Arabia, but does its role in sort of sharing the responsibility of running an organization, very similar to the UN or the Arab League or African League, right, among different member states. And the member states, of course, are Muslim majority countries: Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, etc. And of course, Iran is the biggest Shia, member. Of course, Sunni and Shia, we don't have much time to talk about the differences, but of course they're like two brands of Islam, the two traditional brands of Islam, similar to Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox, something like that. At any rate, he makes a number of interesting remarks and observations, right? So a couple of things. He notes, of course, that conservative Islamic governments, especially those in Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran, also cause Hajj to increase and expand. And that's also interesting, right? He also looks at sort of three waves in the 1960s, the 70s, and the 80s, where in the 1960s you have a wave of nationalism. A lot of the countries in the Muslim majority sort of world, the Arab world, I would say outside of South Asia, because they nationalized earlier, these people started nationalizing mainly 50s and 60s. And in the 70s and 80s, you get the oil boom. And in the 80s also, as a result, you get a population boom in a lot of these countries. So Hajj just goes up, 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 right? You see, of course, that for all the reasons mentioned, nationalism, oil wealth, and population, that the Hajj industry becomes more powerful, more populous, more widespread, more global, and more politicized, of course. All important things for you to keep in mind. Bianchi also does discuss, of course, as Hajj as a modern industry sort of spreads around the world, how increasingly Arabs, Asians, Africans, and Europeans and Americans sort of come online, roughly in that order. So that's very insightful and most appreciated. A couple of sort of final remarks in this regard. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 4, page 70. I'm going to read actually about the first one or two lines of each first paragraph. At the top of page 70 it says, politicizing the Hajj, guests of God, or guests of the state. Although the Hajj has always been political as well as religious, its merger of power and faith is more conspicuous today than ever before. The hallmark of the modern Hajj is that it is an affair of state. Every detail is planned and regulated by governments and international organizations that are pursuing special interests at home and around the world. Every government with a sizable Muslim population has promulgated a Hajj policy in hope that new services will win over grateful pilgrims and new restrictions will ward off potential troublemakers. Let me pause for a second. That means, just like in 1997, when Khatami and the Iranians were in charge of the OIC, and as a Shia non-Arab state, they empowered non-Arab Muslims and Shia Muslims globally. And it means also that when Pakistan or Nigeria, very populous Muslim state, is sort of throwing its weight behind, you know what, we want this quota, right? Hajj is a quota-based system. Every country gets, 50,000 or 100,000. That the more populous you are, the more oil wealth you have, the maybe the more religiously inclined your government is. All of these things are tied to the Hajj. And it's important for you guys to keep that in mind as well. I return to page 70, paragraph 2. Eventually, every government learns that controlling the Hajj carries great dangers and uncertain benefits. Pilgrimage management is an inherently risky undertaking precisely because Islam gives no one the authority to stand in the way of the believer who wishes to visit God's house. So since there is no pope in Islam, we have a bunch of presidents, we have an OIC, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Iran. It does actually, it lends itself to more political conflict. All aspects of pilgrimage policy are under constant public scrutiny. And even supporters of the government are quick to protest measures that appear unduly restrictive, discriminatory, etc., etc. Next paragraph. Politicization of the Hajj is most notorious in precisely those countries that pioneered modern pilgrimage administration. So, you just kind of connect the dots, right? The more sort of modern you become, the more sort of political problems come that are attached to Hajj. Over time, Hajj agencies accumulate enormous power and wealth. They command large budgets and staffs. They control or replace thousands of private businesses. They manage huge investment funds with interests in every economic sector, and they ally with politicians and interest groups in broad coalitions across parties, ministries, and local governments. We should just think about that for a moment. How the Hajj industry, as important as it is spiritually for Muslims around the world, there are lobbies and there are sort of corporate interests and special interests and billions of dollars exchanging hands, and that it is tied to political discourse in general. Finally, above all, pilgrim managers have the power to innovate and discriminate. They have virtually reinvented the way Muslims experience the Hajj. In one country after another, they envelop pilgrimage in detailed rules, often with more zeal for surveillance than for service. It's mind-boggling when you think about how to craft a modern religion, and one that is as important and as populous and as wealthy as Islam, right? And if you look, so the story is one that Bianchi tells quite, I think, captivatingly, innovatively, interestingly, and it is integrally tied to the energy sector, to countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, all of which are major OPEC members. Okay, so something to keep in mind. Briefly about Bahgat's article, Oil and Militant Islam Strains on U.S.-Saudi Relations. You know, you can, of course, you have access to the questions. You've probably heard a lot about this, but it is no coincidence, even outside of this article, that when former King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia died, President Obama flew the next day with First Lady Michelle Obama to pay his reverence to the Saudis, right? He didn't do the same thing in the UK. It's no coincidence that even under the Trump administration, you know, it's Trump with his wife and his daughter and his administration who are not quite fond of Muslims, went all the way to Saudi Arabia, right, to have this sort of celebrated visit. This was last year, of course. I'm sorry, or several months ago. Saudi Arabia is a very important ally for the United States, despite the sort of religious and cultural barriers that have existed ever since the beginning, since, you know, the 1930s. So the article has a number of course, interesting observations about Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 attackers who did not come from Iraq or Afghanistan, right? They came mainly from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Emirates, a couple of other countries, right? Lebanon. Something to keep in mind. About Walker and the revenge of the Shia, you hear this term, the Shia crescent, right? It's something that now in the region, in the Middle East, you hear, especially among Gulf critics, Saudi Arabia and, you know, the Emirates especially, that there is the danger of the Gulf crescent sort of extending itself. I'll send you guys a map later, or you can even Google, you know, Shia crescent, and what it means. But he has, of course, some good insights about Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Zarqawi here. Of course, I told you to watch the spelling. A sort of light jihadi terrorism and a sort of violent brand of it. So, in any case, you know, there are a number of insights over here that have to do, of course, with the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which, in many by many estimates, is sort of the original sin as far as global terrorism, right? And linking global terrorism back with oil wealth, etc. The U.S. invasion and occupation, and really the sort of dismantling of the Iraqi state, established a new order in which terrorism looked for weak states. That began with Afghanistan in, you know, 1970s and 80s, but it really went into overdrive in 2003 when they moved to Iraq, for a while in Yemen, right? So this jihadi sort of based terrorism looks for weak states, and in 2003 they were offered one of the most oil-rich states in the world to come and basically set up camping. The last article by Parsi, what does the author say about the effect of the U.S.-Iran deal on political notions of diplomacy, war, strength, and weakness? I asked this question. You will note, friends, Trita Parsi is a sort of diplomatic figure who, you know, he had an observer status when President Obama signed the Iran nuclear deal, which now I think is off as far as the Americans are concerned. You can see more of his writings, but Trita Parsi is someone who is very much an advocate of diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. See what he says, right? What does he say about diplomacy? What does he say about war? And think about how our country, how here in the U.S., we've changed direction under Obama from having a diplomatic sort of engagement with Iran, which was very difficult to do, to now having a more bellicose, belligerent sort of relationship with Iran, which also comes with a great deal of difficulty as well. Your thoughts are welcome. I look forward to reading more on the discussion forum. Keep it coming, guys. For those celebrating, happy Eid, and I will be in touch with you guys soon.